Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. This is one of a series of short videos looking at the idea of development in global politics. In this video, we're going to focus on the terminology we use to describe this group of countries we generally call developing. In particular, we're going to examine the meaning of the terms third world, developing, and underdeveloped. So let's get started. One of the first things we discuss when I teach courses on the politics of development is the various terminology used to describe this group of countries. There's a lot of possible groupings and words used to describe these countries. Indeed, students often react to the term third world with disdain, believing it to represent an inappropriate or unfair hierarchy. We may even think the term itself is discriminatory, reflecting an inherent hierarchy in the world with the United States, Europe, Australia, and other Western powers at the top, and the vast majority of the world's population at the bottom. Under this framework, the first world is sometimes called the West, or the global North, is rich, with relatively small population, long life expectancies, and low child mortality rates. And the third world, by contrast, is usually defined by its poverty and its large population with short life expectancies and high levels of child mortality. But the truth is somewhat more complicated on that along a couple of different dimensions. The term third world itself actually has some very specific historical origins. It was first used following the 1955 Bandung Conference, where the non-aligned movement emerged. Remember that at the time, the Cold War was in full force. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were actively recruiting allies, and many countries in the global South were emerging from colonialism, having only gained independence a few years earlier. Some 29 countries participated in the Bandung Conference, and they shared a common interest in articulating their own path of development, a non-aligned movement that did not fall either into the American or the Soviet camps. It was the first such international meeting involving leaders from across Asia and Africa, and most of them rejected both American capitalism and Soviet communism as economic and political models, preferring instead to articulate their own political and economic systems appropriate to the specific cultures, histories, and societies of their own countries. They saw this as a third way, a path between American capitalism and Soviet communism. That third way became closely associated with the term third world, which was closely tied to principles of anti-imperialism, regional solidarity, and the non-alignment that were articulated at the Bandung Conference. As most of them had only recently achieved their independence, they advocated an ideology of anti-imperialism. By anti-imperialism, the Third World was expressing its disapproval of the colonial system from which most of its members had only recently emerged. At the Bandung Conference, they thus committed themselves to opposing colonialism and imperialism where it continued to exist, as in much of the case of Africa and Asia. They also committed themselves to working together collectively to solve their problems at the regional level. This idea is usually expressed as regional solidarity and suggests that cooperation between and within Africa, Asia, and Latin America would be a key to achieving development outside of the American and Soviet models. Indeed, during this period, Patrice Lumumba is advocating his vision of Pan-Africanism, a united Africa, and Gamal Nasser is advocating for a Pan-Arabism. And finally, they also promoted the idea of non-alignment. By non-alignment, the Third World was committing itself to avoiding the system of American and Soviet alliances that were increasingly dominating the global system and dividing the world into two distinct camps. Instead, they sought neutrality in the Cold War. The political significance of the term Third World has largely been lost today, and the term began to fall out of favor in some circles. In its place, countless other terms have been proposed, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. Perhaps the most common is the phrase developing world. This is the term you'll find in most World Bank literature and most development textbooks. It's seen as being fairly neutral, avoiding some of the political baggage of the idea of third world. But it's also problematic. Some accuse the phrase developing world of privileging a particular kind of development, and particularly of casting development as a linear process along which countries may steadily move. But development is neither a uniform nor a linear process. Further, the term developed suggests that there is an endpoint to this process, a final goal or line after which a country has reached the end. It is now developed. But is this actually the case? Has the United States or the European Union ceased developing? I'd suggest not. Historically, the phrase industrializing country was often used. This term, however, has also fallen out of favor, both because it privileges a particular form of development, namely industrialization, and because many industrialized countries have now moved into a post-industrial era. This is particularly true in places like the United States or Western Europe, where the vast majority of economic activity now takes place not in industrial, but instead in service sectors. Under these conditions, it really doesn't make sense to talk of industrialization as a defining feature of development or as a way to differentiate between regions of the world. Some Marxist and neo-Marxist scholars have argued we should talk about underdeveloped and overdeveloped countries. From this perspective, the economic growth of the developed world, particularly during the colonial era, but even afterwards through processes of neocolonialism, was predicated on the underdevelopment of the colonies. This is sometimes expressed through the language of core and periphery. The language of underdevelopment is meant to draw attention to the idea that while the countries we think of as being developed today may have at one point been undeveloped, they were never underdeveloped. That is, they never experienced the social, political, economic, and cultural disruptions caused by colonization. As a result, the starting point was never even. It's not as though we're all just at different points along the same historical trajectory. Rather, the theory of underdevelopment contends that the Global South has been systematically undermined and as a result starts further back than the Global North ever did. The path taken by the countries of the Global North is thus not available to the countries of the Global South. In his classic text, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Walter Rodney writes, "The decisiveness of the short period of colonialism and its negative consequences for Africa spring mainly from the fact that Africa lost power. Power is the ultimate determinant in human society, being basic to the relations within any group and between groups. It implies the ability to defend one's interests and, if necessary, to impose one's will by any means available. In relations between peoples, the question of power determines maneuverability in bargaining, the extent to which people survive as a physical and cultural entity. When one society finds itself forced to relinquish power entirely to another society, that in itself is a form of underdevelopment." Rodney himself was a Pan-African Marxist, professor, and political activist. He was killed in a car bombing, largely believed to be the work of Lyndon Forbes Burnham, the president of Guyana. As an advocate of Pan-Africanism, Rodney had clashed with Burnham on numerous occasions. In recent years, the designation Global South has become more common. This term captures the geographic division of the world largely into two hemispheres by the Brandt line, which is noted in blue on the map here. Of course, this term is also problematic as some developed countries like Australia and New Zealand are geographically located in the south, while some developing countries like Mexico, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and others are geographically north. There is, in short, no perfect or uniformly agreed term to describe this group of countries, and as a result, many different terms are sometimes used. But that's it for now. I hope you found this useful. Be sure to check out the other videos in this series, and have a great day. Thanks for watching, everyone. Bye.